Hello, this is The Jay Show, and this is Dr. Jay Smith here in London. I've got with me a special friend, Sarah Foster. And you have been working with us here at Pfander Center for Apologetics for a number of years. You have done a lot of research, and your particular interest is in slavery because you are a descendant of slaves, are you not?
Yes, and I find it's Muslims that remind me of this. When I go to Speaker's Corner, or I used to go to Speaker's Corner, I would have many Muslims come up to me and say, "How on earth can you be a Christian? Don't you know what they did to your people?" And then I looked into it and I saw that Islam has a very long history of slavery itself. So it was actually Muslims who reminded me or pointed me to this issue.
So that is what we're going to be talking about in these episodes, slavery.
Yes.
And you have always been told, and this is the narrative that we've always had here in the West. This is the narrative that I've grown up with, having grown up in India, where you've grown up here in Britain, here in London, in the schools. There has only ever been one slavery, only one area of slavery, and that is West Coast slavery, or you might say the European slavery, the whole Western world of slavery. That's all that you've ever heard.
Yep, that was what I was taught in school, the transatlantic slave trade. So that's Europeans taking Africans from Africa to America and to the Caribbean. So that's the only slavery I knew about. And
it makes sense because you're here in Europe and it's the European slave trade. And myself, I'm from America. We have about 30 million descendants of slaves, a huge population of slaves. So it's the narrative that we would expect to hear.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, though, that Muslims have come up to you, and they were the ones then saying, you were imprisoned by slaves, you and your ancestors were imprisoned by slaves, therefore you should come back to Islam, because Islam does not have a slave problem. And that's what you've been hearing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been hearing. Muslims telling me, how on earth can you be a Christian? Don't you know the history? And then I started looking at the history of Islam and found, hold on a second, there's a history of slavery as well. And yet no one talks about it. At least in the West, it's taught in schools. There's been apologies, there have been monuments, there have been books and films written. I wanted to explore Islamic slavery.
Okay. This is why we wanted you to come on for these series of episodes. I can't think of a better person, but you've gone even beyond that. You've actually taken this material back to the west coast of Africa, and you just came back recently from doing a tour of Gambia. Now, explain Gambia. Why is Gambia important to this whole issue?
Gambia is an absolutely beautiful country with beautiful people. It's right on the west coast of Africa. It was colonized by the British for a number of years, and it kind of follows along the river. It's a beautiful, wonderful country.
In fact, it's really the only colony of Britain in all of West Africa. They needed to have a toehold there.
Yeah.
And as I understand, I lived in Senegal for 5 years, so Gambia comes right through the middle of Senegal.
Yeah, Senegal completely surrounds the Gambia, and it's the only.
They took a boat, didn't they? They took a gunboat up the river of Gambia, and they shot out different cannonballs on either side of the boat, and wherever the cannonball lay, where it came to rest, that was the border.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why it follows directly the river, the Gambian River.
I think it's the only country actually named after a river. I could check that.
Because it's designed by the river, you might say. So this is a particularly interesting country. Why is it interesting?
Well, this is very interesting because there was this film or this TV series called Roots. Roots.
Huge in America.
Absolutely huge, and then came over to Britain.
Alex Haley, Dr. Alex Haley was the author of Roots.
Yep, and there was a whole TV series, and this was where people were getting their understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. It showed people rushing into Africa, grabbing Africans, putting them on the ships, the horrendous the boats, the travel across the sea, and then it follows the lives of a few people as they've gone into slavery and the rapes and the beatings and just the mistreatment and complete dehumanization of certain people. And it kind of goes through, as some of them create families, but this is where our understanding of slavery came from.
Well, so it's Alex Haley, isn't it? It's his ancestor, Kunta Kinte, who is the one that came from Gambia, who came to America, that he starts the story out with.
Yeah, so this is what he says. Alex Haley, the author of the book, traced his family line back to the Gambia. To a person called Kunta Kinte, and we follow this person, Kunta Kinte, from being taken from Africa to his travels in America and his time in America. And so this is why it was really important and really, really quite poignant to go back to
Because
the Gambia.
what a lot of Americans now do is they come to Gambia. Since they can't find their records, they haven't done the work that Alex Haley does. They take his story as their story. So they attribute their beginning with Kunta Kinte, and they go to this one village where Alex Haley went and found his ancestor by accident. As we now know, that was probably a fraud. We won't go into that right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have their oral history, there's some written history, but it's an amazing place, and they take you to this little island, James Island, where they used to keep the slaves before they transported them across. And interestingly, even in terms of abolition, this is where, after slavery ended, the British ended it, this is where the same Gambia, ships were used to stop other slave boats taking slaves. So Gambia has an amazing history from being a place where slaves were taken to being a place where there was the fight to stop slavery as well. This is a 94% Muslim country at the time, and I was fascinated that all of the slavery narrative was about the transatlantic slave trade and not the trans-Saharan slave trade. And while I was speaking to some of the people there, they acknowledged that yes, there was a trans-Saharan slave trade which was run by Arab Muslims, but the whole focus was on the transatlantic, and I was just curious as to why that was. And so I just brought this material. Some of it you're going to hear today. Some of it, I didn't bring everything, but some of it you're going to hear today. And I just wanted to question, why is the focus on the transatlantic, not on the trans-Saharan? Could it be the sensitivities
so we're going to do a
with regard to the
comparison
religion?
between the two slave trades. So you're giving it, one is trans-European or transatlantic,
Yes.
and the other is trans-Saharan.
Yes.
And then there's also an East Coast slavery, which is up the Red Sea. So we're talking about three different areas: East Coast, West Coast, and North.
Yeah, so I mean, the transatlantic, crossing the Atlantic Sea to the Americas. So that was the Western European slave trade. But I also wanted to look at, and we're going to go through it as we look at the topics, the slaves that went east to the Saharan, as Jay said, the slaves that went up into Europe. We're also going to look at the slaves that went further east into Asia.
Okay, we're going to do some things. We're going to look at how closely linked, as you say, is the transatlantic to the trans-Saharan slave trade. We're going to ask that question. Then we're going to go into what roles did colorism have to play? Now, explain that, because this is the first time I've ever heard this, and you've kind of created this. This is something that you've come across almost by accident. What do you mean by colorism?
Yeah, well, so as I was looking into the trans-Saharan slave trade, and we kind of knew, I mean, if you look at the transatlantic slave trade, the European slave trade, it was mainly black Africans that were taken, and there was connotations with regards to the color black. But this was also a feature in the trans-Saharan slave trade as well. And so we're going to follow how color became a very, very important part of the slave trade, and what in fact color means, how it shifted over the times to say somebody is white or somebody is black. Was that always the case? Was color always fixed like that, or was it more fluid? So this is some of the things we're looking at in colorism.
Now this is, and you're going to unpack some stuff that's very explosive. And I've never heard some of the stuff that she's going to be bringing up. As we go through these different episodes, she is going to be going right, you're going to go right back to the quotes, the quotations from some of the household names, Muslim household names, like Ibn Sina, Ibn Khaldun.
Yep.
You're going to be going back to people that we know, Muslims have grown up with. These are the John Calvins, the Augustines of the Muslim world, you might say. And you're going to say what they thought about black people, what they thought about the black color. Fascinating. I never come across this before. But that's, as we move on, we'll be moving into that. And then you're going to look and see what role Islam had to play in all of this. Why is it this distinction in color? Why is it that it's just African slaves that are demeaned the most and black African slaves? So we're going to unpack that. Now, let's look at the slide that we have here. I want to look at the topics. These are the topics we're going to go through. We're going to start with the relationship between the transatlantic and trans-Saharan slave trade. And we're going to call it trans-Saharan, but it also means East Coast as well. Because we're going to talk about the East Coast slave houses. Zanzibar and Lamu. These are household names.
We're going to come to that. We're not doing that today, but
not
we
today,
will come
I know.
to it.
See, my wife grew up going to Lamu all the time. Yeah. And so she always thought that these slaves always went to America. Living in Kenya her whole life, she always assumed, because that's what they said, all the slaves went to America. None of them went to Americas.
No.
to North and South America.
No.
So we're going to dispel that myth. We're going to look at what slavery is, define it. And you're going to unpack that for us. We're going to look at what slavery is in the Bible, look at, and compare it with what slavery is in the Quran. We're going to also look at what Jesus said about slavery, and then what Muhammad said about slavery. So we're going to do a comparison. And the reason we're doing this, Sarah, is because we want to go back to the original source.
Yeah, and not just what they said, how they lived their lives, what slavery meant to them, how their example as to how we should view slavery.
How Jesus treated slave, how Muhammad treated slave. We're going back to the Book of the Man, We have to do that, don't we? And then we're going to look at how the disciples, how they dealt with slaves.
Yeah. So how did the people that Jesus taught, what was their understanding that
the
Jesus gave
Sahaba
them?
of Jesus.
Exactly. So we're going to look at Jesus' disciples, and then we're going to look at the Sahaba.
The
so
Sahaba
what did,
of Muhammad.
Exactly.
And for those who don't know what we're talking about, basically the Sahaba would be the companions. They would be the ones that learned it from the man himself. So the Sahaba for Muhammad would have been those who were the companions, Abu Bakr, Uthman, all those who became caliphs, all those that wrote it down, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Ibn Masud, Ibn Musa. These are the names of the Sahaba, well known in Muslim circles. The disciples would be the equivalent for us. The 12 disciples, they would be the Sahaba of Jesus Christ. So we're going to look at those as well. Fascinating how you bring that out. And then we're going to look at the literature on slavery, what Islamic literature says about slavery, what it says specifically about slavery in Africa, and also, this is what's interesting, slavery in Europe.
Yep, slavery in Europe.
I mean, I'd heard this, but I didn't really think it through. The Muslims didn't just enslave black people, they also enslaved Europeans, white people as well.
Yep.
There's a whole white slave trade that went on. So that's unique. And then, of course, slavery in Asia, the whole other area. So you've done an awful lot of research here. This is new. And for most of us who are watching this, this is going to be brand new. And then we're going to look at how did it get abolished.
Yes.
And you're going to, this is where it really comes to a head. How and who did the abolishing of slavery? Was it the Muslims that abolished slavery, or was it the Christians that abolished slavery? Which and who were at you might say, at the spearhead of the abolition movement? And this is going to be exciting.
Yeah, and we're going to look at their reasons for abolishing it. What was their motivation? What examples were they drawing from? Are they going back to the Book of the Man, or where are they drawing their inspiration?
And it's so good because you're going to come around full circle.
That's it.
And show that it is Christianity uniquely that has abolished slavery. And it's been Christians that uniquely have abolished slavery. And it's because of their scripture and because of the example of Jesus Christ, the Book of the Man. And then we're going to look at modern day examples. So we're going to look at 16 different areas as we unpack it. We need to get right into that. So let's start with an overview of the transatlantic slavery. Tell us give us a overview. Some of this you may have heard already, but nonetheless, Sarah, we need to be reminded. Give us a background to the transatlantic slavery.
Yeah, so as we progress on this topic, these course of talks, we're not defending the transatlantic slave trade. I think we all acknowledge that this was a pitiful time in history, many, many lives lost. It involved between 12 to 15 million Africans being taken from their home countries in Africa and then gone through, we call it the Middle Passage, on the ships, where they were packed in like sardines. There was no toilet facilities, people defecated on each other's blood. Many people didn't survive, and they came over to the Americas and to the Caribbean, and if they did survive, they were sold off like animals, often naked and branded, all kinds of things like this. And so when we talk about the Americas and the Caribbean, we call this the New World. That's the kind of language that they use. And they were just reduced to poverty in many cases. So no better than an animal that you would just breed to create more slaves. And it was a life sentence. You were a slave, that was what you were, your children were slaves. If you had a good master, maybe they would treat you well. If you didn't, then there was pretty much no recourse in law. And this perpetuated through many generations. We're talking about 400 years and until it was abolished. And so we're looking at between 1455, this is when the Portuguese first took Africans to the Americas, and then Britain put the law in through Parliament and then finally abolished it in 1813.
We're talking about not even 400 years.
Yeah, a little less than 400 years.
Less than 400 years. Hold on to that, because 400 years is, we're going to come back to that because we're going to compare that with Islamic slavery, which is much, much longer than 400 years.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the mid 1400s up to the beginning of the 1800s. That's just when it began to be.
That is when the British put through Parliament, we call it an Act of Parliament, into law that you can no longer trade slaves.
So that was the first in Europe. In fact, it was the first in the world.
Well, when we get onto Christianity and slavery, we'll see how many times actually slavery's been abolished in Christian lands.
Okay, this is all going to be new. Are you listening? I didn't even know this. This is something new I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we're going to look at earlier abolition movements. But at least officially, we always go back to 1807,
Yeah.
Wilberforce, the Clapham sect, and the abolishment in Parliament here in Britain. So we always think of it as British were the first to actually abolish slavery. But we're going to get back to that. So it's going to be a whole nother episode that we're going to move into that. Yeah. But just 400 years, you can remember 400 years that the transatlantic slavery existed. So let's ask, what happened before the transatlantic slave trade?
The Portuguese first took slaves in 1455. This is the 15th century.
Okay.
And my friends and I, we used to talk about this, and I had a friend who would say, well, how is it that Europeans can just come to Africa like that and just take people? Wasn't there a fight? Wasn't there, uprisings against this? How on earth could they just take people into slavery?
Was there something already in existence
Well,
there?
this is what we found out, that there was already a system of slave trading, and it was run, in many cases, by Arab Muslims. And we get not only the fact that they were operating the slave trade, but we also get the writings from very prominent Muslim scholars like Ibn Khaldun. So remember, transatlantic started in the 15th century. Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century, he says this. He says, the Negro nation are as a rule submissive, and when it's talking about Negro, it means black people. They're submissive to slavery because they have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to dumb animals. He later goes on and says they cannot be considered as human beings.
Okay, they've got it right there on the screen.
Yeah.
This is really the 1300s moving into the, he died in 1406. So we say 14th century because that's when he would be writing.
But look at the attitude. So this attitudes that we often hear from the transatlantic, that it was a completely a European racist system, of which exactly it was. But it didn't start there. We see something earlier in the Islamic slave trade.
Can I give you a personal note on this?
Go ahead.
We lived in West Africa for 5 years, my wife and I, between 1986 and 1991. And we lived inland in a place called Thiès. And our next door neighbors were Tukulors. They had been Islamic since the 11th century, their families. And so we would go down to Dakar, and I remember taking two of my friends, Ali was his name, and his cousin came along with us, and we went down to Dakar, which is the capital right on the coast. And we went out to an island called Gorée,
Yes.
which was the slave island. And I wanted to go see it, and so they came with me. And we went out there, and we noticed all these Americans, Black Afro-Americans. They had just come in a beautiful air-conditioned bus.
Yeah.
And they got off the air-conditioned bus and got on an air-conditioned boat to go out to an air-conditioned restaurant where they had lunch out on the island. And my two friends have never been in hardly been air-conditioned in their whole lives. They were looking at these people, and they said, isn't it interesting? We enslaved their ancestors. And now they're coming back in air-conditioned buses, coming on air-conditioned airplanes, landing and staying in air-conditioned hotels, because in Senegal it is bristling hot. It was 40 degrees, 45 degrees every day. And they said, and I kind of turned to them and said, isn't it ironic? Your people enslaved their people. And now they're coming back much richer than you are. They have the cameras, they have the air conditioning, they can go all over the world. You have never been on an airplane in your life, you never will, because you can't afford it. And I said, here's the irony, look what has happened. And they said, yes, in fact, we did all the enslaving, and they told me that our ancestors used to war against their ancestors. They would be defeated. We put them in chains and sold them to the Arabs.
Yeah.
And I said, well, why do you think we're going out to Gorée? See, why is it that these slave houses were not on the mainland? And they said, well, it's very simple. The Westerners, the Europeans, they didn't have any resistance to all the diseases that were on the mainland, malaria and all the others. So they had to go to the islands, Gorée Island off the coast, and that's where they did the transactions. Because if they ever came inland, they would have died. It was well known as white man's graveyard. And there were many missionaries, Moravian missionaries, who went to West Africa.
Yeah.
And the average missionary died within 2 years. Yet they still kept coming, knowing that they'd be dead in 2 year. So it's fascinating. So really, it was the Arabs who bought slaves. These were prisoners of war. All of them were prisoners of war, taken in chains. This view, the opening sequence on Alex Haley's Roots is Europeans coming with cutlasses and enslaving people in the villages. There's no documented case of that ever happening. And this is one of the things that was confronted, Alex Haley was confronted with. He got his message wrong. It was always Africans enslaving. It was just normal tribal warfare. And in the past, they would make them slaves of themselves, but now it was much more lucrative to sell them to the Arabs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even that is under dispute as well. How normal was it for Africans to be enslaving Africans on the scale needed for the trans-Saharan and the transatlantic? That seemed to be something that was developed as the slave trade developed.
As the profit got greater,
Yeah. But
as the need became.
As you're saying, there was a trade system already there, fully fledged trade system of slaves in place in the 14th century before the transatlantic started in the 15th century.
Yeah.
And Ibn Khaldun, I mean, he's a household name. He is a big scholar in Islam. And the reason why we stress this is because it's not like Christianity, and Protestant Christianity anyway, where we completely rely on our Bible. Mm-hmm. There could be scholars, Christian scholars, who are writing things, but they don't have the same influence over our religion because our faith is completely, we believe in tota scriptura, which is the whole of scriptura, and sola scriptura, only scripture.
We have this discussion all the time.
Yeah.
Do we follow Calvin or do we follow Arminius? I follow Arminius. You probably follow Calvin. And many people within Christianity...
But he's not God to you. You don't believe that he is speaking the divine will of God.
Absolutely not, And the fact that I can even dispute with Calvin or dispute with Luther or any of the other great men of God, and including Billy Graham today, I don't go to Billy Graham or I don't go back to Calvin or Luther or Augustine to find out what I'm to believe. I go right to the gospel
You go
itself.
right to your gospel.
And that's why Luther, one of the first things he did was to translate the scripture so everybody could read it for themselves.
Yes. So very, very important in Protestantism that we go back to scripture
But
and
Muslims
not.
don't.
This is a thing. So many of my Muslim friends, maybe they will talk about their elders or their imam, and they would rely on them a lot, and take the word of the scholars over sometimes even the word of the Quran.
But even when you look at the Quran, it just doesn't make sense. We've said this many times. I mean, you try to read this book and you try to understand it, and as you go through it, it just jumps all over the place. There's nothing that flows. There's not any complete story except for one.
And if it was just the Quran, that's one thing, but we have the Quran, we have the Hadith, we have the Sirah, we have the commentaries.
You need an awful lot to help you to understand this book.
Yeah.
So you can understand why these men are important.
Very, very important. So the words of the scholars in Islam is not the same as the words of the scholars in Christianity.
Nothing again.
When Ibn Khaldun
so this is huge.
Yeah, when Ibn Khaldun is saying black people cannot be considered as human beings, this is a big deal.
Okay.
This would be like the Pope saying it to Catholics.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to another one. Let's go to the 13th century.
So we're looking back from the transatlantic and we're going back century by century, and we're now in the 13th century looking at Al-Tusi. So he is a Shia Muslim scholar, and he was actually a Grand Ayatollah. And he says this about black people. He says the Negro...
Grand Ayatollah would be like the Archbishop.
Yeah.
So he'd be like the Pope for the Sunni, for the Shiites at that time.
You take his word very seriously if you're a Shia Muslim. The Negro does not differ from any animal in anything except the fact that his hands have been lifted off the earth. Many have seen, he goes on, but I'll just highlight this bit. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro and more intelligent.
Oh my. Something like this, to me, you would never read this today. Yeah. You would not be permitted to read something like today. And yet this is from one of the most authoritative individuals from Shiism.
So, I mean, they're completely, Ibn Khaldun has stripped the humanity out of black people. Al-Tusi is saying that we're like apes. And I'm glad that we have these writings. I'm glad that we can see where these attitudes came from and can trace the pattern of thoughts. It's good that we can see this and we can discuss it.
I've never read this before. These are new stuff for me. Yeah. Until you introduced this to me, Sarah, I had never come across this before. Let's go back to the 11th century now. Now we're moving into 980 to 10. We're just moving back century by century. And now we're with Ibn. Now, Ibn Sina is huge.
Yeah, he is huge. He's a Hafiz, so he's memorized the
That means
Quran.
he memorized the entire Quran.
Yeah, yeah, an Islamic psychologist, theologian, scholar. He's a big deal with some people. He says blacks are people who are by their very nature slaves.
Yeah. I mean, this is sad when you start to think the implications of that, and you can see why people, if this is what they're being fed, if this is what they're believing, and if these men of this stature are saying these kind of things, you can then understand that why this became quite normal in that day.
It changes your attitude. It changes your view towards black people, your expectations of who they are, where they should live, what work they should do, all kinds of things.
Now we go to the 10th century, so even before now.
Al-Muqaddasi. So again, he's a Muslim geographer. So he is someone who people would rely on to go to different parts of the world,
right,
and write back accurate information
so
about what he sees.
So he traveled an awful lot. He traveled, being a geographer. He was a well-traveled man. What did he say about?
He said, as for the
Africans?
Zanj, so the Zanj is like, well, we get the modern day Zanzibar from it. It's the east coast of Africa. He says the people there are of black colour, flat noses, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence.
Again, this is just I mean, it's sad. It's difficult to read.
Yeah.
I know that there are some people that have that viewpoint today.
Yeah.
And if you ask why do they have that viewpoint, could it be because of these references?
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling because it's still quite shocking as you read it. But you can start to see where these attitudes come from. And yeah, well, we can talk about that when we use modern day examples as that's coming
At
up.
Speaker's Corner, how many times when you've been on the ladder with me, they would start going, go back to the trees. But they would do these kind of things. And I always kind of wondered, where in the world are you getting that from? What is it that's telling you that?
Yeah.
Now I can see they've been going back. They have been reading this.
It doesn't happen a lot. It's very, very rare. But especially at Speaker's Corner, if I'm on the ladder, usually every time we've heard someone shout slave.
Well, now you can see why.
Yeah.
If this is what they've been reading, if this is all they've come across, if this is the only narrative they've heard, then you can see, and this has been going on for 1,000 years. Yeah. Now we're going back to the 9th century, and this is Ibn Qutayba.
Yes, and so he is a renowned Muslim scholar. He's from Iraq, and he talks about the blacks being ugly and misshapen because they live in a hot country.
Oh dear. As if Africa is the only hot country on earth, but it's fascinating that they even give the reason why they think that they must be ugly and misshapen. That's just awful.
So clearly he hasn't come across black people before. He's trying to reason or make sense of why their colour is different.
Let's go back again to the 9th century. Al-Jahiz, what does he say?
He says, the Zanj, the African blacks, they're the worst of all men and the most vicious of creatures in character and temperament.
So you can see, and let's go, here's another quote by him.
Yeah, he says they are the least of understanding, the least discerning, and the least capable in their consequences of action. So he's just
least intelligent.
Yeah, of all mankind.
I mean, it's this kind of stuff that we've got this. We've had this at Speaker's Corner. Interesting, as Speaker's Corner is one of the few places where they feel they can say exactly what they believe. And we hear this repeated over and over. You've heard it. I didn't know before this is where they're getting it from. I just assumed this was their own personal experience, but actually it's not just their personal experience. They actually believe it.
Yeah, and I should say I find many Muslims don't have this attitude at all. But it does come up quite regularly, and more regularly than you would think for someone living in the 21st century, living in the West.
Why is it that those people, the great men, these household names, these are the men that you've respected all your life, why do they say these things? Let's just finish with one more, Al-Jihaz here. Again, the same fellow that we did earlier. What is he saying?
Yeah, he talks about the Zanj, and he's saying, despite their dimness, their boundless stupidity or crudeness, their crude perceptions and their evil dispositions, make long speeches. And so he's just using every word that he can think of just to really put down the black man, the black woman. Boundless stupidity, crude perceptions. I mean, it just goes on and on. And the evil one, I think, is the most disturbing. What is evil about the colour black? And I think we're going to look at that a little bit later.
We're going to bring you to that. And I see now that we're going to have to wrap this session up. Thanks for coming on. Right. Thanks for coming and sharing this. So we're going to do an awful lot more of this. Come back with us. Stay with us. There's an awful lot more yet to learn. This is Jay then, here in London, over and out.